At 6:14 p.m. on my 33rd birthday, sitting at a restaurant table with a slice of cake I hadn't touched yet, my phone buzzed once against the tablecloth. I almost didn't look at it. My mother was mid-sentence, my sister was pouring wine, and for a few minutes I'd actually managed to forget about work entirely, which for me, that year, was rare enough to notice. I looked anyway. Habit, mostly. Effective immediately, your position has been eliminated as part of a company restructuring. Please return your laptop and badge by Friday. HR will follow up regarding final pay and benefits. Thank you for your contributions. 6 years. 6 years of nights, weekends, quiet fixes nobody saw. A system I had built almost entirely alone that the company's biggest clients relied on every single day, reduced to a text message sent to my personal phone while I was sitting in front of a birthday cake with candles still unlit. Not a call. Not a meeting. A text, formatted the way you'd write to cancel a delivery order. I want you to hold on to that image, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly how much that single text message was hiding, and exactly how carefully it was timed. This isn't a simple story about getting fired. There's a turn coming that I promise you will not see coming, and I need you to stay with me all the way to the end to understand why. If stories that build slowly and pay off big are your thing, subscribe now, because this one earns every minute. And tell me in the comments, has anyone ever delivered devastating news to you in the coldest way possible, just to avoid a harder conversation? My name is Naomi. I was 33, and for 6 years I'd worked as the lead systems architect at a mid-size logistics software company, the kind of company most people have never heard of, but whose platform quietly runs the shipping schedules behind a lot of household names. Here's the part that matters. I hadn't just worked there. I had built the core piece of infrastructure the entire company's biggest contracts depended on, a routing and inventory synchronization system that kept our 3 largest clients' warehouses talking to each other in real time. I built it from a rough prototype in my second year, rewrote it twice as we scaled, and by year 5, I was the only person left at the company who understood every layer of it end to end. Not because I hoarded the knowledge, because nobody else had stayed long enough, or gone deep enough, to actually learn it the way I had. I reported to a VP of engineering named Grant, a capable enough manager in most respects, mostly hands-off, mostly trusting, right up until 8 months before my birthday, when a new chief operating officer named Foster joined the company and started, in his words, modernizing how we think about technical risk. Foster's actual project, it turned out later, was something much narrower than that, but at the time, all I saw was a new executive asking a lot of pointed questions about key person dependency, a phrase he used constantly, always aimed loosely in my direction, always framed as a legitimate operational concern. "It's a risk to the business," he told me once, in a hallway conversation I didn't think much of at the time. "If one person is the only one who understands a system this critical, what happens if you get hit by a bus tomorrow?" I remember laughing it off. I told him I'd been meaning to write better documentation for years and just never had the bandwidth between actually keeping the system running and everything else on my plate. He nodded, said something about prioritizing that going forward, and the conversation ended there. I didn't think about it again until the night of my birthday, staring at a text message that used almost the exact same corporate language he'd used in that hallway 8 months earlier. I won't drag out the part where I fell apart, because I did, and I don't think you need every detail of it to understand what came next. I'll just tell you the parts that matter. I didn't fight the firing. There was, on paper, nothing to fight. Restructuring is one of those phrases companies use specifically, because it's nearly impossible to challenge, vague enough to mean everything and nothing at once. I returned my laptop on Friday, the way the text had asked. I signed the severance paperwork a week later, mostly on autopilot, because fighting felt like it would cost more than it would win. What I noticed, in the weeks that followed, was smaller and stranger than the firing itself. My old work email got auto-forwarded to me by accident for about 4 days before someone caught the error and shut it down, long enough for me to see a handful of internal messages that didn't quite fit the story I'd been told. One, from Foster to Grant, read, Let's move quickly on the transition before the Q3 board review. Better to have this settled before anyone starts asking harder questions about system ownership. Before anyone starts asking harder questions, not before the system breaks, before someone asks. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I didn't have enough to understand what it meant yet. I just knew it didn't sound like ordinary restructuring language. It sounded like someone managing a timeline around something specific and doing it deliberately before a board review, not after some organic operational review process. I filed it away, not out of some grand plan for revenge, just out of the same instinct that had made me a good systems architect in the first place. When something doesn't add up, you don't ignore it. You just wait until you have enough pieces to see the actual shape of it. Then I moved on with my life, as much as anyone can. I took a short-term contract at a smaller company. I stopped checking my old coworkers' social media. I told myself, mostly successfully, that 6 years was over, and whatever Foster had been managing around that board review wasn't my problem anymore. 3 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang from a number I hadn't saved, and a voice I recognized instantly said my name like it belonged to someone drowning. "Naomi, thank God you picked up." It was Grant, my old VP, the man who had signed off on the text message that ended 6 years of my life with less ceremony than a spam notification. "I need to be honest with you," he said, and his voice had none of its usual measured calm. "We have a serious problem, and you're the only person who might actually understand what's happening." I let the silence sit for a second longer than was comfortable, mostly because some part of me needed to feel it. The specific, quiet satisfaction of hearing someone who'd erased me in a text message now sounding like he genuinely needed me to exist. "What kind of problem?" I said, keeping my voice level. "The synchronization system," he said. "It's been failing intermittently for almost 6 weeks. 3 of our biggest clients have had warehouse discrepancies. One of them is threatening to walk entirely if we can't explain what's happening by end of month." 6 weeks, almost exactly matching the timeline of whatever Foster had been rushing to settle before the Q3 board review. "Who's been maintaining it since I left?" I asked. A pause. Foster brought in an outside contractor, said it was time to modernize the architecture, reduce what he called key person risk. They've rebuilt parts of it. We don't fully understand what they changed, and the contractor's no longer responding to calls. I felt something settle into place, cold and precise, the way it always did when a system finally made sense after staring at broken pieces of it for too long. "I need you to understand something before I agree to anything," I said. "I'm not doing this as a favor. If I come back in, even temporarily, I need full access to everything, every changelog, every commit, every decision made since I left. Not a summary, everything." "Whatever you need," Grant said, and I believed for the first time in 3 months that he actually meant it. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story where everything starts turning into something much bigger than a system outage. I came in on a temporary consulting contract, my terms, my rate, no illusions about permanence, and spent the first 2 days doing exactly what I do best: reading, quietly, methodically, without announcing every thought out loud before I understood it fully. The contractor Foster had hired hadn't just modernized the system, they'd stripped out 3 separate failover safeguards I'd built years earlier, the exact redundancies that existed specifically to catch discrepancies before they ever reached a client's warehouse data. Removed, not because they were outdated, but because, according to the commit messages, they were unnecessary complexity that increased maintenance overhead. That phrase sat wrong with me immediately. Those failovers weren't complexity. They were the entire reason the system had run clean for 4 straight years without a single client-facing incident. I dug further back, past the contractor's changes, into the internal messaging archive Grant had given me access to, the same archive I'd glimpsed briefly, by accident, 3 months earlier, and there it was, laid out in full this time, instead of one stray sentence. A thread between Foster and a name I didn't recognize at first. A director, at one of our 3 largest clients. Foster had been quietly negotiating, for months before my firing, to bring that client's entire logistics operation in-house, replacing our platform with a competing system his brother-in-law's company had built. My system wasn't a liability he was managing. It was the single biggest obstacle standing between him and a deal that would have made him a great deal of money on the other side, once the client's contract with us officially lapsed. He didn't need me gone because of key person risk. He needed me gone because I was the only person capable of noticing exactly how badly that new system would perform against the one I'd already built, and specifically, capable of proving it, in detail, to the client before they signed anything. Here's the piece that finally connected everything, and it's the part I want you to really sit with, because it's the actual twist underneath everything that's happened so far. The Q3 board review Foster had been rushing to get ahead of wasn't a routine business update. It was the meeting where the board would formally approve, or reject, a major vendor transition proposal Foster had already quietly drafted, moving our largest client off our platform entirely onto the system his brother-in-law's company had built, under the banner of reducing single vendor dependency and modernizing legacy infrastructure. If I was still employed at that review, in the room, with full knowledge of the system's actual architecture, I would have been the person the board turned to for a technical assessment of that proposal, and I would have told them, accurately, that the replacement system Foster was proposing had none of the failover protections that had kept our largest client's warehouses running incident-free for 4 years. He didn't fire me because of restructuring. He fired me, by text, on my birthday, specifically so there would be no meeting, no conversation, no formal record of me raising a single objection before that board vote happened. Because a text message requires no response, no rebuttal, no witness in the room. The failing system I'd been called back to fix wasn't an accident of neglect. It was the system Foster's own contractor had built, sabotaging the older one they'd inherited from me just carelessly enough, to manufacture a crisis urgent enough to justify rushing the client onto the new platform even faster than originally planned. Except the new platform wasn't ready yet, and the manufactured crisis had spiraled into something he could no longer control. He'd built a trap to push me out before I could stop his deal, and in doing it too quickly, too carelessly, he'd broken the very system he needed to look competent enough to replace it. I sat with all of this for 2 full days before I told anyone. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think it's the most human part of this entire story. Part of me wanted to walk away completely, let the system fail, let the board review collapse under its own weight, let Foster's deal implode publicly, in the worst possible way, in front of the exact people who'd let him fire me by text without a single question asked. That part of me sat with the idea for 2 days, and I won't pretend it didn't feel satisfying to imagine. But underneath that instinct was something quieter and more important. 3 of our biggest clients, and dozens of ordinary employees who had nothing to do with Foster's deal, were about to get caught in the collapse of a system I'd spent 6 years protecting. Warehouse discrepancies weren't an abstract inconvenience for a board meeting. They were real shipments, real delays, real jobs on the other end of every one of those failures. I decided, finally, that the version of this story I actually wanted to tell, the version I could live with, wasn't one where I let something break out of spite. It was one where I made absolutely sure the right people understood exactly what had happened and let the consequences land on the person who'd actually earned them. I asked Grant for one thing before I'd agree to fix anything: a direct, documented presentation to the board, alongside him, laying out both the technical failure and its actual timeline. Not a private conversation that could quietly disappear, but a formal record, the exact thing Foster had engineered my firing specifically to prevent. Grant hesitated for exactly as long as it took him to remember he had 3 angry clients and no other option. The board meeting happened 11 days later. I stood in a room I hadn't set foot in for 3 months and walked the board, methodically, through the actual architecture of both systems, the failovers that had been stripped out, the commit history showing exactly when and how, The internal messages showing Foster's negotiation with the client's director going back months before my firing, and the timeline showing my termination landing 4 days before the original board vote had been scheduled. I didn't editorialize. I didn't need to. The dates did what dates always do when you finally lay them out next to each other in the right order. One board member, a sharp older woman I'd never spoken to before that day, asked the only question that actually mattered. Are you telling us the vendor transition proposal on this quarter's agenda was built specifically to benefit a company owned by the COO's family member? I'm telling you what the documentation shows, I said. I'll let the board draw its own conclusion. Foster, sitting 3 seats down the table, didn't have an answer that survived the silence after that question. I watched something in his composure finally crack. The exact moment a plan built entirely on nobody looking too closely finally met a room full of people looking very closely indeed. I won't pretend to know every detail of what happened to Foster internally after that meeting. Those conversations happen behind doors people like me don't get invited back into, and by that point, I genuinely didn't need to know. I'd gotten what I actually came back for, the truth, on the record, in front of the people who could actually act on it. What I do know is that the vendor transition proposal was pulled from the agenda that same day. The client who'd been quietly courted for months stayed on our original platform, once I rebuilt the failovers that had been stripped out, and the incident stopped within a week. Grant offered me my old role back, with a title and compensation that finally matched what I'd actually been carrying for years before any of this happened. I want to tell you I said yes immediately, out of some clean, satisfying sense of vindication. I didn't. I asked for 2 weeks to think about it, because trust, once it's been erased by a text message on your birthday, doesn't rebuild itself just because the person on the other end suddenly needs you again. I did eventually go back, not for Grant, and certainly not for Foster, who was gone from the company within a month. I went back because I still believed in the system I'd built, and because I finally negotiated something I should have insisted on years earlier, a role, a title, and a documented importance that made it impossible for anyone to reduce 6 years of my work down to a single line in a text message ever again. Here's what I want you to take from this, more than the satisfaction of watching Foster's plan collapse in front of a board of directors. The cruelty of that birthday text wasn't really about cruelty for its own sake. It was strategic, calculated, timed with a precision that had nothing to do with me as a person, and everything to do with a business deal I never even knew existed until I went looking for it. That's a specific, unsettling thing to sit with, realizing the worst moment of your professional life wasn't really about you at all. You were simply an obstacle standing in someone else's path, and the fastest way to remove an obstacle is to make sure it never gets a chance to speak before the decision is already made. If there's one thing I'd tell you to hold on to from everything that happened to me, it's this. When something ends too fast, too coldly, too conveniently timed around a date or a meeting you weren't told about, that timing is information. Don't let the speed of the ending stop you from asking, later, calmly, on your own schedule, exactly why it happened when it did. I spent 3 months believing I'd simply been let go. I hadn't been let go. I'd been silenced, deliberately, 4 days before a vote that needed my silence to succeed. The only reason I ever found that out was because I stayed curious, instead of just staying hurt. Curiosity, it turns out, is a much sharper tool than anger ever was. If you're sitting with an ending right now that felt too sudden, too convenient, too coldly timed to make sense, I'm not telling you every one of those endings hides a conspiracy. Most of them really are just what they look like on the surface. But some of them aren't. And the only way to know the difference is to stay curious long enough to actually look. Did you see this twist coming? Or did it catch you off guard the way it caught me? Tell me exactly where you started suspecting something was off. I read every single comment. And I promise you, this room is full of people who've had an ending land on them far too conveniently timed to be an accident. If this story kept you here until the very end, hit subscribe. The next one might be the twist you really don't see coming.